Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about listening strategies, and this is video 1 in a 2-part series. And this is going to talk about why listening first is important and some things to do to actually help your child to maximize their listening. My absolute favorite auditory verbal strategy. I will teach you what that is and how to use it. And in part 2, you'll get some activity ideas and how to incorporate those. And then we'll talk also about, again, why auditory verbal therapy is important and why we use listening first. So I'm gonna jump into that right now. So why listening first? And that is the first strategy that, parents are taught in auditory verbal therapy. And what that means is listening first would include keeping their hearing aids on all waking hours, eyes open, ears on, or keeping their cochlear implants on all waking hours, and even speaking to your child first through their hearing it's not just all about watching your mouth and visual cues. Now we're trying to actually teach the brain how to process sound, how to process language. And if your child is always watching you, they're getting so much benefit from that visual cue. And as they grow up, they will naturally be, visual and use those cues. But we're trying to teach them even the harder thing, which is to process without the visual cues, so that their hearing is so much stronger and that they're able to self-monitor just through listening alone. You're going to notice such a difference in their speech in the long run. And this is, I'll get into why that is. So, why do we need amplification early? So we want those hearing aids on, those cochlear implants on as soon as possible, and I will explain why. So as your baby is in the womb at 20 weeks, you usually find out the sex of the child, and you also get informed that their hearing is fully developed. So their cochleas are full size. Their hearing is, their organ of hearing inside their head is full size at 20 weeks gestation. And what that means is your baby is hearing you in the womb, that your baby is, processing those early sounds, listening to your voice. They've done studies that babies can recognize their primary caregiver's voice. When they're born, they can also recognize familiar songs, familiar books that were read to them. And what that means if your child has hearing loss is that they've kind of missed out on that time. And that's not to, make you sad. That's just part of the reality. And so by the time they're born, they're 20 weeks behind, essentially, because of that, 38-week gestation. Then by the time they get, after their newborn hearing screening, if they find out that they possibly have hearing loss, then they get referred to the audiologist. Hopefully they get hearing aids, by 6 months, ideally, by 5 months, by 4 months, by 3 months would be even better. And the earlier the better, because then we get access to sound. And once we have sound, the brain can start catching up. The brain can start processing what is sound, why do I need to pay attention to it? Why is it important? And start to get engaged. The brain is starting to fire those neurons and make those connections. If we don't have amplification, that process still goes on. And if we have severe to profound hearing loss that would be considered deaf, then, and requiring cochlear implantation, right now with where we are in 2020, the best case scenario is in California is typically 9 months at implantation, and that's with our Medi-Cal services. So if you get your cochlear implant at 9 months, woohoo, we'll absolutely party for you. That's fantastic. I've seen kids get implanted as early as 6 months old, and the progress that I saw there and the difference that I saw there was just absolutely astounding. I mean, the child was just so natural in their speech and language. You wouldn't know that they had hearing loss at all. They had bilateral cochlear implants. And so what happens is when the brain, why it's so important, is that the brain is so plastic at this stage. The baby is just forming all the different lobes of the brain, your frontal cortex, responsible for decision making and critical thinking. You have your sensory cortex, which is responsible for all your senses, taking in that information, touch, sensitivities, all of that. You have your occipital, your visual cortex, you have your temporal lobe responsible for hearing and language. And all of these parts of the brain are being formed, and they're being formed by stimulation. Now, if we don't have auditory stimulation, that auditory cortex that's in the temporal lobe is not growing, it's not developing. The other lobes are developing on time, and they're making all of these neurons and connections, and they're firing and they're growing and growing. And the brain says, hey, we have an issue here. And what actually happens, it's called synaptic pruning. The brain starts to borrow from the temporal lobe, says, hey, we need more help in the visual cortex. We need more help in the sensory cortex. We've got a little system down here. And so they'll actually start borrowing neurons to make the other stronger. So your vision and your sensory cortex do get stronger. And your auditory cortex is not there, it's not developed. And we can take that back. We can grow that auditory cortex, and that's what we do in auditory verbal therapy. That's what we do with cochlear implants with hearing aids, is we grow that auditory brain, and we make these kids able to listen and process auditory information, able to make them listeners who are able to speak. And we can do this by taking back the hearing part of the brain and actually decreasing visual cues, because again, that vision is so strong and they're going to get so much benefit from that, but we have to make them do the harder thing, and that's listen. And we have to teach them what sound is and what's important. So often, for example, we'll be playing, shaking a maraca or some bells or a drum behind a child and see if they turn to the sound. And if they turn to the sound, we're like, yay, you heard it. You heard that sound, and helping them make the connection. That stimulation, I didn't even know what sound was. That shaking of the bells, that stimulation was cool. That was you interacting with me. I didn't even know what that was. And so we're training the brain to pay attention to sound and recognize that sound has meaning, and they can connect that sound of the bells to that visual object of the bells. So we're teaching the brain, how to make those connections, taking back the auditory cortex. The next thing that I want to talk about is, again, why auditory first in language and what that means. So we talked about having those hearing aids and cochlear implants on all waking hours, and then 2, decreasing visual cues. You may even see videos or see auditory verbal therapists kind of covering their mouths as they talk to their children. And that's pretty common sometimes because they want to see if their child is hearing the actual words that are coming out of their mouth rather than just reading their lips. Your child, if they have hearing loss, I read lips as well, they will become excellent lip readers. And that's a remarkable skill that they'll always have. But in order to know that they're really processing the language, sometimes we have to check if they're actually hearing us, or if they're just reading our lips and taking in those visual cues. So we'll do a thing like a Ling 6 sound check to make sure that they're hearing all the sounds and the frequencies of speech. So we'll, cover our mouths and say shh, and see if the child can repeat shh, that they heard it correctly. So those types of things, auditory first, so hearing first, and then they show it. So my favorite strategy, and I feel like the most important strategy that for parents to learn soon and quickly and early, is called the auditory sandwich. And what an auditory sandwich is, it's giving a message auditory first, so making sure that the child can't see your mouth, then repeating it once or twice if they need a second repetition, again, without the visual of your mouth. And then if they didn't understand it, if they couldn't follow through, either for attention or not understanding, then you give them the visual cue, and that could either be letting them see your mouth, it could be pointing to what you were talking about, it could be some other type of visual cue or a gesture, or using ASL to give them the message. Then they can associate, oh, that's what you were saying, I get it now, and they can associate the auditory with the visual. And then the sandwich part is so auditory, visual, then auditory again is following through. So I'll give you an example. And repeating the message is your last auditory part. So auditory, verbal, auditory. So I'll give you an example. You say to your child, hey, can you go get your shoes? And they, just kind of stare at you. And you're like, did you hear me? I don't know if you heard me. Hey, can you go get your shoes? And they, again, still quite didn't hear you, maybe you repeat it a third time after you've given them some wait time. One more time, hey, can you go get your shoes? And they're like, shoes, what are shoes? Maybe they didn't understand you yet, right? Maybe it's, your child's just learning to listen. Then you go show them, you point, oh, your shoes, get your shoes. Can you go get your shoes? And you say it in the same way you said it the first time. Then they can make that connection. They're really building that neural connection in their brain. Oh, shoes, that word pairs with this visual thing that I already know. Maybe you often, ask them to get your shoes. Go put your shoes on, as you're getting your keys, as you're giving them these visual cues, signaling to them that, okay, it's time to go. I know I need to get my shoes on. So oftentimes we have these natural cues that we give ourselves away, and our children are so intuitive that they can just follow the routine given the visual cues, but they may not actually be processing the words that you're saying. So this is kind of checking in with them, making sure they're processing the words that you're saying. Another auditory sandwich, here's an example. Can you go get your cup from the kitchen? And, maybe they, again, didn't understand you, follow the same procedure. Can you go get your cup from the kitchen? And maybe they didn't hear you again. Can you go get your cup from the kitchen? Make it a little bit more clear. They still didn't understand. Hey, can you go get your cup from the kitchen? If they know ASL, or you could point or show them, walk them over. Hey, get your cup from the kitchen. Then they say, oh, okay, cup, kitchen, I got it. Or, you're reading a book and you say, do you see the zebra? And again, if you're reading the book together, hopefully they're next to you and not just staring at your mouth the whole time, and you can just naturally say, do you see the zebra? And maybe they're, again, don't know what zebra is yet. You maybe repeat it one more time. You point to it, the zebra right here. Do you see the zebra? And then they're like, oh, zebra, that's what you were talking about. I can connect that word now with the visual that I might already recognize. So that is your auditory sandwich, my favorite strategy, and I think the most important, because that's just how you teach your child. Nothing is punitive. You're just growing their ability to learn, and you're kind of getting a little diagnostic. Do they know this word yet or not? Or this direction as you go along. And so you're kind of testing and teaching at the same time, and your child is getting the benefit of hearing it multiple times, and repetition is, one of the number one strategies as well for listening and spoken language. The last thing I want to talk to you about in this video is called auditory memory. So I just gave you some examples in the auditory sandwich of building auditory memory. So auditory memory is the ability to retain information that you heard in your mind. So if I tell you a sentence like, I went to the store yesterday, and give you a pause, then your brain should naturally be able to repeat that sentence back to you in your head like an echo. Now, auditory memory, that is auditory memory. That's your auditory feedback loop. And we have to develop this skill in kids with hearing loss so that they're able to learn, they're able to process sentence length, conversation length information. They're able to listen to a story and remember what you said. So this is a really important skill to develop, and we start very early. We start immediately, essentially. So the first building block is teaching them to associate sounds with an object. Like you say moo, and they know that that was the cow. The next level would be to teach them, where is the cow? And they could grab, listening to that longer sentence, they grab the cow. The next step would be to be more of a random routine direction, like go get your shoes, without context, and they could follow that. Then from there, you would say, maybe a two-step direction or a two-part direction, like go get your cup from the kitchen, or get your shoes and your jacket, or get the ball and the car. That would be a 2-unit auditory memory. And in my part 2 video, you'll see a lot more strategies to grow and give you some ideas on how to grow that skill and find out where your child's at on that auditory memory hierarchy. And so yeah, auditory memory is so foundational. Stay tuned for the part 2 video so that you can start to grow your child's auditory memory, see where they are. Let me know if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. From my heart to yours. Bye.